Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her grip on the M40 sniper rifle as the helicopter descended toward the dense canopy of the Amazon rainforest. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Extract a high-value intelligence asset from a remote research station deep in hostile territory. What they hadn't mentioned was the storm system moving in from the west, turning what should have been a routine insertion into a nightmare of wind and rain. The UH-60 Blackhawk shuddered violently as another gust caught its rotors. Maria's team leader, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, shouted over the engine noise, "2 minutes out. Remember, this is supposed to be a ghost operation. Get in, get our guy, get out. No contact with hostiles if we can avoid it." Maria nodded, checking her equipment one final time. The M40A5 felt familiar in her hands, like an extension of her body after countless hours of training and 3 previous deployments. She had earned her place as the only female sniper in SEAL Team 7 through sheer determination and skill that exceeded most of her male counterparts. Her longest confirmed kill was 247 yards, a record that had earned her both respect and the nickname Ghost among her teammates. The research station appeared through the trees below, a small cluster of prefabricated buildings surrounded by a makeshift landing pad. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a microbiologist who had been working undercover to gather intelligence on illegal bioweapons research, was supposed to be waiting with critical data that could prevent a potential terrorist attack on American soil. As the helicopter touched down, Maria was the first out, her rifle ready as she scanned the perimeter. Something felt wrong immediately. The station was too quiet and there were fresh tire tracks leading away from the main building. Her instincts, honed by years of combat experience, screamed danger. "LT, we've got a problem," she radioed to Morrison as he approached the main building with 2 other team members. "This place has been evacuated recently." "I'm seeing signs of a hasty departure." Morrison's voice crackled back through her earpiece. "Copy that." "Petty Officer Rodriguez found blood in the lab. Looks like our package was compromised." Before Maria could respond, the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire erupted from the tree line. The pilot of their helicopter slumped forward, and the aircraft's engine began smoking. Enemy fighters emerged from concealed positions around the station, their muzzle flashes lighting up the growing darkness as the storm clouds blocked out the sun. "Ambush! Take cover!" Morrison's voice was calm despite the chaos erupting around them. Maria dove behind a concrete barrier as bullets whined overhead, her mind already calculating angles and distances to potential threats. The enemy had chosen their moment perfectly. With the helicopter disabled and storm clouds making air support impossible, her team was effectively trapped in hostile territory with limited ammunition and no clear extraction route. Through her scope, Maria counted at least 12 hostiles moving in coordinated positions around the perimeter, suggesting this wasn't a random patrol but a planned operation. As darkness fell and the rain began in earnest, Maria realized this mission had just transformed from a simple extraction to a survival scenario. The enemy clearly knew they were coming, which meant either their intelligence had been compromised or Dr. Vasquez had been captured and forced to reveal the extraction plan. Her team was outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off from support. The nearest friendly forces were over 200 miles away, through some of the most treacherous jungle terrain in South America. With her M40 and approximately 40 rounds of match-grade ammunition, Maria Santos was about to face the greatest challenge of her military career. The sound of enemy voices speaking in rapid Spanish carried across the clearing as the hostiles began to coordinate their assault. Maria pressed herself against the barrier and checked her ammunition count one more time. Whatever happened next, she was determined that her team would not be captured alive. The intelligence they carried was too important, and the enemy's intentions were clearly hostile. As the first enemy fighter moved into her crosshairs, Maria steadied her breathing and prepared to turn what the enemy thought would be an easy victory into the fight of their lives. The first shot from Maria's M40 dropped the enemy point man before he even knew death was coming. The 7.62mm round caught him center mass at 300 yards and he crumpled silently into the undergrowth. The suppressed rifle made barely a whisper, but the psychological effect on the remaining hostiles was immediate and devastating. Confusion spread through the enemy ranks as they tried to locate the source of the shot. Maria had positioned herself in a depression behind the concrete barrier, using the natural shadows and her ghillie suit to become virtually invisible. Through her scope, she watched the remaining fighters frantically scanning the wrong areas, their discipline already beginning to break down. Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice came through her earpiece in a harsh whisper. "Ghost, we need you to create a corridor to the south. Rodriguez is hit bad, and we need to get him to that secondary extraction point." Maria had studied the satellite imagery during their flight in and knew the secondary extraction point was a clearing roughly 2 miles through dense jungle. Getting there with a wounded team member while being hunted by hostile forces would require every skill she had learned in her 8 years as a Navy SEAL. "Copy that. LT, give me 2 minutes to thin the herd," she whispered back, already tracking her next target through the scope. The second hostile was trying to flank their position, moving carefully between the trees about 250 yards to her left. Maria adjusted for the slight crosswind and squeezed the trigger with practiced precision. Another silent takedown. Another enemy who would never report back to his commander about SEAL positions. But the third shot revealed her general location when a sharp-eyed enemy fighter spotted the muzzle flash through the rain. Suddenly, concentrated fire began impacting around her position, forcing her to keep her head down as bullets sparked off the concrete and chewed up the earth around her hiding spot. "They've got me pinned," she radioed to Morrison. "You need to move now while they're focused on me." Through the chaos of incoming fire, Maria heard Morrison coordinating the movement of their wounded teammate. Petty Officer Rodriguez had taken a round through the thigh and was losing blood fast, but he was still mobile with assistance. The team's corpsman, Petty Officer Williams, was doing what he could to control the bleeding while preparing for a running firefight through the jungle. Maria knew she had to buy them more time. Rolling away from her current position as bullets continued to impact around her, she low-crawled toward a fallen log about 30 yards away. The movement was agonizingly slow, but any faster motion would draw immediate fire from the increasingly agitated enemy forces. From her new position, she had a better angle on the main group of hostiles. Through her scope, she could see them trying to coordinate an assault on what they thought was her original position. Their commander, a bearded man in military fatigues, was pointing and shouting orders while staying safely behind cover. Maria smiled grimly and adjusted her scope for the 400-yard shot to the commander's position. Leadership was always the priority target, and removing the man giving orders would create even more chaos in their ranks. She controlled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat slow as she entered the familiar zone where time seemed to stretch and her entire world narrowed to the crosshairs in the target. The shot was perfect, catching the commander as he raised his head to observe the assault. The immediate effect was exactly what Maria had hoped for. The remaining hostiles began arguing among themselves about what to do next, their coordinated attack dissolving into confusion and fear. But her position was compromised now, and she could hear enemy fighters moving through the brush toward her location. Time was running out and her team was still not clear of the immediate danger zone. She had perhaps 5 minutes before the enemy reorganized and began a more systematic search of her area. Through her earpiece, she heard Morrison's strained voice. "Ghost, we're at the tree line heading south. Rodriguez is stable, but we're moving slow. How much more time can you buy us?" Maria looked at her ammunition count. 36 rounds remaining. More than enough to make the enemy pay dearly for every step they took. But she would need to be smart about conservation. Once her ammunition ran out, she would have only her sidearm and knife against an unknown number of hostiles in their own territory. "Give me their position, LT," she whispered, already planning her next series of shots. "I'm going to make these guys think twice about following you." The pursuit began in earnest as Maria started her own movement toward the jungle. She had bought her team precious minutes, but now 8 remaining hostiles were actively hunting her through the dense undergrowth. The rain had intensified, turning the jungle floor into a slippery maze of mud and tangled roots, but it also provided cover for her movements and muffled sound. Maria moved like a ghost through the vegetation, using every technique she had learned in advanced survival training. She stepped only on solid ground or exposed roots, avoided disturbing hanging vines, and constantly checked her back trail for signs of pursuit. Her ghillie suit blended perfectly with the jungle environment, making her nearly invisible even at close range. Behind her, she could hear the enemy crashing through the undergrowth with far less skill. These were clearly local fighters, familiar with the terrain but lacking the sophisticated training that made U.S. Special Operations forces so effective in hostile environments. Their lack of noise discipline would make them easy to track and eliminate one by one. After moving roughly half a mile deeper into the jungle, Maria found what she was looking for, a massive fallen tree that created a natural blind with excellent fields of fire. She settled into position and began the deadly game of cat and mouse that would determine whether her team made it to extraction alive. The first pursuer appeared in her scope at 180 yards. Moving carelessly along what looked like an animal trail, Maria had positioned herself to cover this exact route, knowing that humans naturally followed paths of least resistance even when being tactical. The shot was almost too easy, and another hostile disappeared permanently from the equation. But the sound of his body falling alerted the others to her general area. She heard urgent Spanish voices calling out, and the remaining pursuers began moving more carefully, using proper bounding overwatch techniques that suggested at least some military training. Maria knew she couldn't stay in this position much longer. The enemy would eventually surround her if she remained static, and her ammunition was too precious to waste on long-range shots through thick vegetation. She needed to keep moving, stay ahead of the pursuit, and pick her targets carefully. Her earpiece crackled with Morrison's voice. "Ghost, we're about half a mile from extraction. Rodriguez is hanging in there, but we're moving slow. What's your status?" "7 hostiles down, still tracking me, but I'm staying ahead of them," she whispered back. "Continue to extraction. I'll link up with you there if possible." What Maria didn't tell her team leader was that she was beginning to suspect this entire operation had been a setup from the beginning. The enemy had known exactly when and where they were coming. They had prepared positions around the research station, and they seemed to know the location of the secondary extraction point. Either their intelligence had been catastrophically compromised, or Dr. Vasquez had been turned and was now working for the enemy. As she moved through the jungle, Maria's mind raced through the implications. If the extraction point was compromised, her team was walking into another ambush. But without communication with higher headquarters, there was no way to call for alternate extraction or warn Morrison about the potential trap. She had to assume the worst-case scenario and prepare accordingly. That meant eliminating as many pursuers as possible before they could reinforce whatever forces might be waiting at the extraction point. It also meant she needed to arrive there ahead of her team to scout the area and neutralize any threats. The next hostile appeared through the vegetation about 150 yards away, this one moving much more tactically. He was using proper cover and concealment, checking his corners and advancing in short bounds with his rifle ready. This was clearly someone with real military experience, possibly a former soldier or even special operations. Maria took extra time with this shot, knowing that a miss would give away her position to someone who would know how to respond effectively. She controlled her breathing, felt her heartbeat slow, and gently squeezed the trigger at the exact moment her crosshairs aligned with the target's center mass. The impact spun the hostile around and dropped him immediately, but not before he managed to fire a short burst that revealed Maria's muzzle flash to his teammates. Suddenly, the jungle around her erupted with incoming fire as the remaining pursuers concentrated their weapons on her position. Maria was already moving before the first bullets arrived, rolling away from the fallen log and into a depression she had identified during her initial reconnaissance. Rounds snapped overhead and shredded the vegetation where she had been lying just seconds before. Now the real test would begin. The enemy knew her approximate location and was closing in fast. She had 29 rounds left, no support, and hostile forces potentially waiting at the extraction point. Between her and her team's survival stood at least 6 more enemies and 2 miles of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. But Maria Santos had not earned her reputation by backing down from impossible odds. She checked her rifle one more time and began planning her next move. The chase through the jungle became a deadly dance of survival and precision shooting. Maria moved like a predator through her natural element, using the terrain to her advantage while the remaining 6 hostiles spread out in an attempt to surround her. The rain continued to fall in heavy sheets, reducing visibility but also masking her movements and the sound of her suppressed rifle. She had been moving for nearly an hour when she realized the enemy had made a critical tactical error. In their eagerness to capture or kill her, they had stretched their formation too thin, creating gaps she could exploit. Maria climbed silently into the canopy of a massive cecropia tree, using the dense foliage to conceal herself while gaining an elevated firing position. From 30 feet above the jungle floor, She had a commanding view of the area through her scope. The hostiles were moving in a loose line formation, trying to sweep through the jungle systematically. But their lack of proper training showed in their spacing and communication. They were using hand signals incorrectly and making enough noise to alert wildlife throughout the area. The first target presented himself at 220 yards, moving carelessly along the base of a steep ridge. Maria's shot caught him as he paused to check his map, and he dropped silently into the undergrowth. The remaining 5 hostiles didn't even notice their teammate had disappeared, continuing their advance while being picked apart one by one. 20 minutes later, Maria had reduced the pursuit force to 3 fighters, but her ammunition was running dangerously low. She had 18 rounds remaining, and the extraction point was still over a mile away through increasingly difficult terrain. Worse, her earpiece had been silent for the past 30 minutes, suggesting her team was either maintaining radio silence or had encountered problems. As she prepared to climb down from her elevated position, Maria spotted movement that made her blood run cold. Through the trees ahead, she could see the distinctive camouflage pattern of additional hostile forces moving toward the extraction point. This wasn't just a pursuit force. It was a coordinated operation designed to trap her team in a killing zone. She counted at least 8 new fighters moving in tactical formation toward the clearing where Morrison was supposed to call for extraction. They were well-equipped, moved with military precision, and carried what appeared to be man-portable surface-to-air missiles. Any helicopter attempting to extract her team would be shot down before it could even land. Maria's worst fears were confirmed. This entire operation had been a setup from the beginning. Dr. Vasquez had either been captured and broken, or she had been a double agent all along. Either way, SEAL Team 7 was walking into a carefully prepared ambush with no way to call for help or request alternate extraction. She keyed her radio, hoping Morrison's team was still monitoring their frequency. Blackbird Actual, this is Ghost. The LZ is compromised. Say again, the LZ is compromised. At least 8 hostiles with anti-air weapons in position. Do not proceed to primary extraction. Static filled her earpiece for several long seconds before Morrison's strained voice responded. Ghost, we're already committed. Rodriguez needs medical attention ASAP, and we have no alternate extraction. Can you neutralize the threat? Maria looked through her scope at the enemy positions around the clearing. 8 well-positioned fighters with automatic weapons and missile systems spread out in a defensive perimeter that would be nearly impossible to assault alone. With her remaining ammunition and no support, it would be a suicide mission. But as she watched the enemy preparing their ambush, Maria noticed something that gave her a spark of hope. The hostiles had positioned themselves to cover the most likely helicopter approach routes, but they had left gaps in their perimeter that could be exploited by someone with the right skills and equipment. More importantly, she could see their command element. 2 officers with radio equipment positioned near a large mahogany tree at the far end of the clearing. If she could eliminate the leadership and disrupt their communications, the rest of the force might break down into confusion long enough for her team to reach the extraction point. The plan that formed in Maria's mind was desperate and extremely dangerous. But it was the only option that gave her team any chance of survival. She would need to get within 400 yards of the clearing, eliminate the command element with precision shots, then create enough chaos to allow Morrison's team to reach the LZ before enemy reinforcements could respond. With 17 rounds remaining in her rifle, and her team's lives depending on her marksmanship, Maria Santos began what would either be the most successful solo assault in Navy SEAL history or her final mission. She checked her equipment one last time, said a silent prayer, and began her approach to the killing zone. The rain continued to fall as she moved through the jungle toward her date with destiny, her M40 rifle ready to turn what the enemy thought would be an easy ambush into their worst nightmare. Maria reached her firing position just as the sound of approaching helicopters echoed through the jungle canopy. The extraction birds were still 10 minutes out, but the enemy was already preparing their surface-to-air missiles and coordinating their fields of fire. She had a narrow window to execute her plan before her team walked into certain death. From her concealed position 380 yards from the clearing, Maria could see the entire enemy formation through her scope. The 2 command officers were exactly where she had spotted them earlier, standing next to their radio equipment and pointing out firing positions to their subordinates. They would be her first targets, followed by the missile operators who posed the greatest threat to the incoming helicopters. Her first shot took the senior officer in the head at 380 yards, dropping him instantly and sending the radio operator diving for cover. Before the enemy could react, her second shot eliminated the communications specialist, severing their ability to coordinate with other units or call for reinforcements. The psychological effect was immediate, as the remaining fighters began looking around frantically, unable to locate the source of the devastating accurate fire. But Maria's position was partially compromised when one of the hostile fighters spotted her muzzle flash through his binoculars. Enemy fire began impacting around her location, forcing her to relocate while continuing to engage priority targets. She rolled away from her original position, just as automatic weapons fire chewed up the ground where she had been lying. The next two shots eliminated both missile operators, ensuring that the extraction helicopters would at least have a chance to reach the landing zone. But 6 hostiles remained, and they were beginning to coordinate their response despite the loss of their leadership. Maria could hear them shouting to each other in Spanish, trying to establish a new chain of command and locate her firing position. Through her earpiece, she heard the distinctive sound of her team approaching through the jungle. Morrison's voice came through clearly. "Ghost, we're 200 yards out and moving to the LZ. What's the status on hostile forces?" "Command element eliminated, missile threat neutralized, but 6 hostiles still active around the perimeter," Maria responded while tracking another target through her scope. "I'll continue to suppress until you reach the extraction point." Her 5th shot of the engagement dropped a hostile fighter who was trying to reposition his machine gun to cover the most likely approach route, but her position was becoming untenable as the remaining enemies began concentrating their fire on her area. Bullets snapped overhead and impacted the trees around her, sending splinters of wood flying in all directions. Maria knew she needed to relocate again, but movement would expose her to the enemy's increasingly accurate fire. She had 11 rounds remaining and needed to make each one count, as her team's survival depended entirely on her ability to keep the hostiles suppressed until extraction arrived. The sound of helicopters was getting closer now, and she could see Morrison's team emerging from the tree line at the far end of the clearing. Rodriguez was being supported by 2 teammates, still mobile but clearly in serious condition. They needed to cross 200 yards of open ground to reach the landing zone, and the remaining hostiles were already shifting their weapons to engage the exposed SEAL team. Maria's next 3 shots eliminated the fighters, who posed the most immediate threat to her team's movement across the clearing. Each shot was perfectly placed, dropping the targets instantly and buying precious seconds for Morrison to get his wounded teammate to safety. But her rapid fire had finally given away her exact position, and the remaining hostiles were now focusing all their attention on eliminating her. A hail of automatic weapons fire forced Maria to keep her head down as bullets shredded the vegetation around her position. She could hear the enemy fighters communicating and moving to flank her position from multiple directions. With 8 rounds left and at least 3 hostiles still active, she was running out of both ammunition and time. Through the chaos of incoming fire, Maria heard the beautiful sound of approaching rotors as the extraction helicopters finally arrived on station. But she also heard something that made her blood run cold: the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The enemy had called in indirect fire support, and high explosive rounds were about to rain down on both her position and the landing zone, where her team was waiting for pickup. The first mortar round impacted 50 yards from her position, showering her with dirt and debris. The second landed closer, and she realized that the enemy had her position bracketed. The next rounds would be right on target, and there was nowhere to run in the dense jungle vegetation. But Maria Santos had not survived 8 years of special operations by giving up when faced with overwhelming odds. She had 5 more shots to eliminate the remaining threats and ensure her team's successful extraction. As the mortars continued to fall around her and enemy fighters closed in from multiple directions, she steadied her rifle for what might be her final engagement as a Navy SEAL sniper. The final moments of the engagement unfolded with deadly precision, as Maria Santos transformed what should have been her death into the enemy's complete destruction. With mortar rounds falling around her position and hostile fighters closing in from 3 directions, she did something that went against every tactical manual. She stood up and began engaging targets while completely exposed. Her seventh shot eliminated the mortar spotter, who had been directing the indirect fire, immediately stopping the barrage that threatened both her position and the landing zone. Her eighth round dropped the machine gunner who had been suppressing her team's movement toward the extraction helicopters. Each shot was fired while bullets snapped past her head and impacted the trees around her. But Maria had entered a zone of complete focus, where nothing existed except her rifle and the targets threatening her teammates. The psychological effect on the remaining hostiles was devastating. They had expected to overwhelm a trapped and desperate enemy, but instead found themselves being systematically eliminated by what seemed like a supernatural force immune to their weapons. Two of the remaining fighters broke and ran for the jungle, abandoning their positions rather than face certain death. Maria's ninth shot caught the last organized hostile as he tried to coordinate a final assault on her position. The man had been shouting orders and waving his rifle, making himself an obvious target even through the chaos of the firefight. When he dropped, the organized resistance completely collapsed, leaving only scattered fighters fleeing through the jungle. But the engagement was far from over. As Maria began moving toward the landing zone to link up with her team, she spotted movement that made her realize the true scope of the enemy operation. Additional hostile forces were emerging from concealed positions throughout the jungle, moving to cut off the extraction helicopters before they could take off with the SEAL team aboard. These were clearly the reserves that had been held back to spring the final part of the trap. Fresh fighters with heavy weapons were positioning themselves to destroy the helicopters on the ground, ensuring that even if the initial ambush failed, none of the American Special Operations personnel would escape alive. Maria had 3 rounds remaining, and at least 6 new targets spreading out around the landing zone. The math was simple. She couldn't possibly eliminate all the threats with her remaining ammunition, but she could disrupt their coordination and buy enough time for the helicopters to take off with her team aboard. Her 10th shot eliminated what appeared to be the leader of the reserve force, a man with distinctive insignia who had been directing the deployment of his fighters. The 11th round dropped the heavy machine gunner who posed the greatest threat to the helicopters during takeoff. But even as these targets fell, Maria could see more fighters moving into position. Through her earpiece, she heard Morrison's urgent voice, "Ghost, we're loaded and ready for takeoff, but we're not leaving without you. What's your position?" Maria looked at the distance between her current location and the landing zone. Roughly 300 yards of open ground covered by multiple hostile firing positions. With 1 round left in her rifle and her sidearm as backup, the odds of reaching the helicopters alive were essentially 0. But as she prepared to make her final sprint toward extraction, Maria noticed something that changed everything. The enemy fighters were all focused on the helicopters and hadn't spotted her new position. They were expecting her to approach from her last known location, giving her a narrow window of opportunity to reach the landing zone undetected. Using every stealth technique she had learned in 8 years of special operations, Maria began a careful approach through the jungle undergrowth. She moved like a ghost through the vegetation, staying low and using natural cover to mask her movement from the enemy fighters who were concentrating their attention on the helicopters. Her final shot came at 150 yards when an enemy fighter turned at exactly the wrong moment and spotted her approaching through the trees. The round caught him center mass, dropping him silently before he could alert his teammates to her presence. But now she was out of rifle ammunition and still 200 yards from safety. What happened next would become legend in Navy SEAL history. Maria Santos covered the final distance to the landing zone in a full sprint, while enemy fighters realized too late that their primary target was escaping. Bullets snapped past her as she ran, but the combination of her speed, the poor visibility, and the enemy's confusion made accurate fire nearly impossible. She dove aboard the extraction helicopter, just as the pilots applied full power for takeoff. Enemy fire impacted the aircraft's armor plating as it lifted off, but the bird climbed steadily into the stormy sky with all team members aboard. As the jungle fell away below them, Maria finally allowed herself to breathe. Her M40 rifle was empty, her ghillie suit was shredded by thorns and bullet fragments, and she was covered in mud and exhaustion. But every member of SEAL Team 7 was alive. Rodriguez was stable and receiving medical attention, and the intelligence about the bioweapons. Research had been recovered from Dr. Vasquez's abandoned research station. The mission that had started as a simple extraction had become one of the most successful single-handed defensive actions in special operations history. Maria Santos had turned a carefully planned enemy ambush into their worst nightmare, proving once again why the Navy SEALs were considered the most elite fighting force in the world.